The Anchorage School District, like all school districts in Alaska, are required to pass a balanced budget. And this is a heartbreaking scenario that the path we're on for funding core services in our state is not sustainable. It's not just education that's breaking right now.
What I think many people are worried about is just the basic solvency of the state. Teachers are good people. They love these students, but love doesn't pay bills.
I have a lot of hope for Alaska, but what I find disheartening is this empty rhetoric that we can have wonderful services, we can get a large check from the government, and we don't have to make any sacrifices. I refuse to talk about education as some free service. There's nothing free about education. Education is about making a concerted investment that goes as deep as the state's constitution that says what our values and North Star are as a state.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, we have three guests: Anchorage School Board President Carl Jacobs, Bettye Davis East Anchorage High School teacher Janice Strickland, and Anchorage School District Superintendent Dr. Jharrett Bryantt. They are all here to discuss the $90 million shortfall in ASD's budget and the severe cuts to personnel and services that balancing that budget will require. Carl Jacobs, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, sir. I am honored to be a part of the show tonight.
Where did you grow up?
So, born in 85, raised in Chicago, and then moved up to Alaska in 2008 and have been an Anchorage resident ever since.
What did you do when you got here?
Yeah, worked a number of different jobs. I started actually as a bill collector and then began working for the state shortly thereafter. Worked for the State Department of Revenue, Child Support Services Division, and the Department of Commerce as an investigator for the Professional Licensing Division. And have since switched over to South Central Foundation, where I work in healthcare compliance. And it's been a unique career arc. When I was just beginning my career with the state, I had an opportunity to begin serving in the role of a licensed therapeutic foster parent. And for a decade, I cared for youth with mental and behavioral health challenges with my spouse, then Alicia. And it was such a rewarding experience that it got me really interested in the Anchorage School District. What I learned as a foster parent advocating for students is not every kid in ASD got the same set of opportunities. And it's been my mission ever since to reform ASD, to bring about positive change. And it's still very much a work in progress. I would say over the course of more than a decade, roughly 60 students in ASD that I've cared for. I think 13 is the total number of graduates that I've seen walk across the stage, which has been definitely a thrill of a lifetime, being able to participate in those ceremonies.
You work full-time at South Central?
Yep, full-time employee for South Central Foundation in addition to my board work. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious if there's a struggle to work a full-time job and do all your duties as the school board president.
It's a great question. And to be completely transparent, the answer is yes, it gets really challenging. I'll say that the workload of a school board member in Anchorage has changed significantly over time. We doubled the amount of work sessions that we held. We're routinely connecting with community councils. We also are responsible for visiting schools as often as we can. There's also a significant number of phone calls and emails, as this is a really challenging time in public education. I list my cell phone publicly for any district parent to connect with me. And so I spend a good portion of the evening each night after work connecting with the community in some form or another. And my PTO balance at work is routinely in single digits because so much of the work that we do doesn't involve attending a meeting in the evening and involves something during a day, whether it be an activity, a ceremony, or a joint assembly school board meeting. There's always work to be done, and it's really rewarding, but it is challenging to maintain full-time employment.
You got elected in 2021 the first time?
2021, yes, sir.
After you got elected and you started doing it, what surprised you most? if anything?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. The quality of the people that are willing to serve in the Anchorage School District who are so grossly underappreciated. We try to honor educators as much as we can, and we can never do enough. The administrators, the support staff, district administration, these people are really salt of the earth individuals who truly want the best for students and often are lumped into this one term, district administration, and you visualize someone sitting in an office working on a spreadsheet all day and not folks who are looking for a sub in a classroom or substituting themselves or are stressing over how they can make a budget work. Folks who are ensuring that students who are economically disadvantaged have access to transportation to school. The host of support services that the unique population of Anchorage students requires is so significant, and those folks don't get enough kudos, nor does any district employee.
In your 5 years, coming up on 5 years on the board,
Yes, sir.
I can't ask any more questions without acknowledging that you guys are facing a $90 million shortfall for the next school year. But I feel like you guys have been struggling with potential shortfalls basically since you were elected. So I guess talk a little bit about what that process has been like.
Sure. It's a great question, Representative Gray. And I think back to school board meetings I watched in preparation for running. And I remember the district both discussing its deficit as well as acknowledging that deficits were expected to grow unless the legislature took action to inflation-proof the base student allocation and indirectly the Alaska Foundation formula that's written in statute. The process for updating and maintaining education funding to an adequate level is so much different for public education than it is for almost any other state department. You as a legislator, for example, know the full well that you can approve a budget that increases the Department of Corrections funding by 60%. And that's something that's necessary, gets submitted to the governor and justified. And there's often consensus for approving department increases, as evidenced by data that the state departments typically are able to keep up with inflation much better than the Department of Education early development budget. K-12 education funding has just been different. And the only reality this current board knows, which I believe is the longest serving 7-member board in ASD's history, is one of having to reduce expenses or allocate one-time funds to cover budget deficits in a way that was never sustainable.
Would you say that you're coming up on the most difficult budget puzzle of your time?
I completely agree with that statement. And in part, it's because of the picture in Juneau. There has been hope annually that the legislature could step in, could appropriate one-time funds that could cover structural deficits, not just in Anchorage, but Matsu's facing a $20 million deficit, north of $20 million deficit. They're currently discussing what services they want to cut. I know other rural districts are facing some really hard challenges as well. I think the difference this year, Representative Gray, is that the legislature isn't in a position to take quick and meaningful action to inflation adjust education funding without some really hard choices that take a lot of political courage. And to be frank, the track record for making those decisions and gathering consensus around those really hard political decisions isn't there. And therefore, I think it's rational, reasonable, and appropriate to expect a budget that we are looking at effective becoming July 1 that looks significantly like what we're about to adopt. And in past years, we haven't had that lack of optimism. I think the sole exception in this particular case is there is an opportunity in April with a roughly between $11 and $12 million levy that Anchorage voters can approve that will provide some relief and reduce class sizes, which would be an amazing opportunity. But help from the state is far from a sure thing. And I think advocacy looks different this year because of the state's fiscal picture, which is really challenging right now.
Well, I'll just speak about that as a legislator. You know, Oil prices are low and not expected to go higher. I mean, that's just a reality. And the current federal administration has cut money that we used to get from the federal government. 37% of the state budget was federal money, and there are cuts there. So we have less money than we've had in the past, full stop. And our savings are not that robust. That said, I absolutely have advocated for inflation proofing the BSA, for more money to the BSA period. But I have to just put it in context that we had a hearing yesterday about the audit of OCS. And, I said multiple times on the record that OCS needed to be asking for more money, that they were not paying their caseworkers enough in order to attract caseworkers to the job, to fill their vacancies, to lower the caseloads of all the OCS workers so that all the OCS workers could do their job better. So I'm ranting and raving about how they should be asking for more money. And at the same time, as chair of judiciary, I'm ranting and raving that the reason why we have such a backlog in our criminal justice system is that we don't have enough prosecutors and defenders. They have too many cases. And so we have, in lots of different areas, massive needs for additional revenue to be able to fix really big problems. And so I guess when I hear things like, well, we need legislators to be brave. Like, I'm being as brave as I can be. I'm screaming that everybody needs a lot more money. We're in a situation where we have no money and we can't spend our savings and we need a lot more money. I'm just giving you a little window into what it's like for me.
Sure, yeah. And listening to Gavel, as I do often on background, I hear firsthand that the state's fiscal picture is dire if things continue without a sustainable long-term fiscal plan. That probably looks like new revenue. I think it's time to have those discussions. The challenge is that we currently have a governor who has vetoed revenue measures, which is really disappointing. Until we get that consensus in Juneau, I think we're going to really have trouble funding a state that provides services that our citizens deserve. The only thing I'll say, I actually am the former president of the state employees union here in Anchorage, the chapter here in Anchorage, and I'm deeply familiar with the fact that state workers, generally speaking, aren't adequately compensated. I know that the wage study that was relatively recently released by the Dunleavy administration recommends significant raises that the state is now proposing we spend time studying how we can implement that.
It's crazy.
It's not a reasonable path forward, and our state workers deserve better. Ultimately, I think public education served as the canary in the coal mine that our fiscal plan was broken. And now we're seeing a lot of things break in the state, like skyrocketing cases for OCS workers, like adult public assistance staff failing to process applications in a timely manner, like the Office of Public Advocacy struggling with their caseloads. I mean, seniors, children, rural Alaskans, everyone's being impacted by our lack of a fiscal plan. And so it's not just public education, and that's what's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Essentially, the proposal on the table, as I understand it, is to raise class sizes by 4 students per classroom and to cut a number of sports programs completely: tennis, gymnastics, volleyball, swimming, diving, hockey, wrestling, cross-country skiing, soccer, riflery, to be cut entirely. And then there's also a number of miscellaneous academic reductions, just all over the place: library aides, kindergarten paraprofessionals, elementary summer school, reading specialists, psychologists, counselors, custodians even being cut. Anything high level that I'm missing?
Yeah, I'll say that the first cut covered by Dr. Bryantt in our briefing was district administration was the first thing that he reduced. The budget that we allocate towards district administration, which is 5 cents on the dollar, is one of the lowest in the state in terms of the percentage of our general fund budget. With that said, we still are going to be asked to vote on a budget that reduces district administration, which I think is appropriate and responsible. But I think it's important to note that the folks in those roles that are performing that work make the work inside our schools possible. And at a certain point, we're going to reduce the level of support and service that our schools get because the work district administration does is so important. The other thing that I would mention really about the level of cuts is that there isn't an area of the district that isn't impacted. I think you mentioned psychologists, the behavioral health supports that our students need and deserve. We've eliminated certain security positions, assistant principals, so cutting those positions, which often perform critical roles that take work away from classroom teachers to ensure that they're able to focus on the responsibilities that they should be focusing on. And then a change to the middle school model, which would result in less planning and collaboration time for our middle school educators, a new format for how we allocate nursing staff, which is a huge concern to me as someone whose students often had medical issues that needed to be addressed during the day, whether it be medications or an opportunity to see a professional at a school campus. And so the district will operate significantly different next year if the proposed budget is adopted.
So if you don't live in Anchorage, you might have some resentment against Anchorage. And what I mean by that is that smaller communities, particularly those off the road system, but even those that are on the road system that are smaller, they just have less. When we talk about the sports that are being cut, for example, there's plenty of legislators that I serve with who, say must be nice to have a swimming and diving team, that sort of attitude that some of the things that we have in Anchorage, they just don't have in rural Alaska. So there can be, I guess, a lack of sympathy. It would be the kind way of putting it, but resentment would be another way of putting it. And so when we're talking about what's happening in Anchorage and the $90 million shortfall, there's definitely sentiment among legislators for other parts of the state. They really don't want to hear about Anchorage's problems. And I think there's an optics issue. I want teachers to be paid well, but I have some concerns about my ability to argue for what's happening in Anchorage with the recent pay raises that were negotiated and agreed upon in light of the $90 million shortfall. You just gave everyone a raise.
Sure. It's interesting to hear that sentiment expressed when school boards across Alaska are asked to ensure that we're not only adequately compensating educators, but we're doing everything we can to retain our educators and then put resources into the classroom as is appropriate. And that looks like making sure that we attract and retain the highest quality teachers. Just a couple years ago, the Department of Education collaborated and produced a educator recruitment and retention study. And it asked the question to Alaska's teachers, how do we keep you in the industry and stop you from leaving the state or leaving the profession? And the most popular answers, by and large, were addressing rising healthcare costs, providing educators an opportunity for a pension like we used to here in our state, and addressing workload and compensation. All those things require a financial investment. And unsurprisingly, there hasn't been a significant amount of meaningful work to address those items at the state level. Now, there are things that our district has done, but ultimately, educators, especially experienced, talented educators, are in high demand. And our state, due to our highest in the nation per capita healthcare costs, the lack of a pension, and the lack of inflation adjustment in our education funding has directly impacted our ability to retain top quality educators. And there aren't the young people looking to become educators any longer. The profession is really suffering, especially here in Alaska, because we aren't providing a competitive wage and benefits package. And there are opportunities to address that, whether it be through healthcare, whether it be through restoring a pension. In absence of those things, higher wages can provide that opportunity to retain an educator, which is financially responsible, especially when Representative Gray, it costs us more than $30,000 to replace an educator. And so there's a real cost to underpaying teachers. And if our legislature or anyone in the community wishes to go on record to state that we should pay our teachers less and intentionally underpay them and not make those wages competitive, I would have a passionate conversation arguing why that's not in the best interest of students. In the same way that the opportunities that students in Anchorage receive, whether it be through sports or a club or activity, I want for all students, including communities in rural Alaska. I'm not looking over my shoulder to another district and wishing we had their opportunities. I hope we all are on the same page that every student in our state deserves the best possible academic experience, and we should all be pushing in the same direction. And the fact that it sounds like we're not, I think tells me that there's a deeper flaw in the system that we really should come together and recognize.
I mean, I don't want to demonize colleagues who might, question Anchorage's needs. I think when you're in this environment of scarcity, people are fighting for their people. And I think that's when people start to turn on each other. Look what you have. You have more than us. That's not fair. We want more. But I just feel like the environment of scarcity breeds that type of rhetoric.
That's unfortunate. I hope that as leaders in our respective bodies and communities, we can join together to start pushing back on that. I want the best for every student in our state. When I advocate for increased education funding, I don't talk about just Anchorage. I talk about getting Mat-Su students the funding they need. I talk about the students in Juneau and in the Cuspok School District, where they're looking at condemned buildings and having to cut core services. Advocacy for students is advocacy for students.
When I interviewed Harriet Drummond for the podcast, she brought up Inlet View. And, we just had the ribbon cutting at Inlet View, and it was $51 million for 180 kids. There are some in the community that would argue that the money for that school would have gone a long way to filling up this shortfall at this particular moment in time. And at least, you live in East Anchorage. I live in East Anchorage. I've had 2 schools close in my district, and those kids be rerouted to other schools. And I think probably from your perspective, this might be an analogy of folks in other parts of the state looking at Anchorage and saying, you've got it so much better than us, don't ask for anything. But I'm in East Anchorage and I'm looking at West Anchorage and saying, you have it so much better than us. I can't believe you just got a new school. Look at all the cuts that are happening. And I don't know how you respond to that.
Sure. It's a long and complicated question. And so the answer is going to be of a significant length as well. Inlet View Elementary has been on the board's capital improvement radar for well over a decade. I think it's close to 2 decades. Jake Metcalf, who I consider to be a friend and a mentor, served on the school board in the early 2000s. At that point, they were discussing ways to remodel and repair that building, which serves a small, unique community within Anchorage, but one that isn't easily served by nearby buildings. With that said, I can't account for why the school boards in the district failed to prioritize that project, but I also know that failing to maintain our capital infrastructure and school buildings is something the district can't allow to happen. And in part because it's our responsibility, we have a fiduciary responsibility to effectively and appropriately manage the property and the buildings that we have, which I think can and should look like consolidation. And I've voted in support of reducing the number of elementary schools that we occupy. In this case, there was specific funding that was allocated to Anchorage from the legislature that was tagged with intent language that the funds should be used for school construction projects. And some of those funds were utilized to put a dent in that project. And then taxpayers were asked to vote on the remainder of that building's cost. And taxpayers ultimately approved a school bond with the remainder of that, the project. And I get a lot of questions about Inlet View, but this board didn't vote to just replace one building. There was actually two that we voted to replace in relatively short proximity that utilized a funding stack that provided a value proposition for Anchorage taxpayers. Ursa Major on base, which serves military families, we received an 80-20 match for that. And that school is in the process of being rebuilt. And I think that that's a good thing for those students and families, and that the cost value proposition really is the same for both buildings, and that for Ursa Major, the Army Corps of Engineers came and evaluated the project and indicated that it was more financially responsible to rebuild that building than it would be to remodel due to the length of life that that building could then be utilized. This relatively same cost analysis was performed for Inlet View. The same result was found. Both projects expended roughly $50 million. And I think ultimately we want for our students that they have buildings that are warm and safe to learn in, that don't have leaky roofs, that don't have sewage backups, that aren't structurally unsound. That's not too much to ask for. And so while in Anchorage, the funding for capital projects is very different than the funding for operations that we receive through the foundation formula. We specifically bond for things that we need, and then the state appropriates additional funds through the school bond debt reimbursement process, which is just now coming back online. And I guess that's the other thing that I would mention is the school construction funding has been especially challenging for roughly a decade, since 2015, when the school bond debt moratorium was put in place. ASD's deferred maintenance backlog grew from a relatively modest amount to more than $1 billion in recent years, because Anchorage taxpayers have been forced to bear the brunt of any improvement to any building that's been made. And that's delayed reasonable repairs to buildings. That has led to more significant repairs having to be done. It's led to the need to potentially replace a building versus looking years earlier to perform a renovation. And so the long-lasting effects of the state failing to invest in capital infrastructure for public education buildings, it can be seen more than in just Anchorage. But I understand why Inlet View is a topic of discussion. It's just unfortunate that it's become almost a political topic instead of really an opportunity to celebrate that we still need to invest in environments that our students can enjoy and appreciate learning in, that are warm, safe, and beneficial to them.
I have two more questions. We don't talk about it enough, that the cost of healthcare in Alaska is very, very expensive, and it gets more and more expensive every year. And I'm not sure that people recognize the huge percentage of the school budget that is going towards employees' health plans.
It's a significant cost driver. And when you look at the cost per teacher, a higher portion than you would expect goes directly to healthcare versus in a educator's bank account. And that is unfortunate, and it's a statewide issue, and it goes beyond a specific industry. It isn't sustainable, and I think the fix ultimately needs to come from a state or federal level. And I don't know what that looks like, to be honest, but I agree in raising the importance of addressing that issue and acknowledging that the per employee cost on paper is so much higher than it should be, because we have the highest per capita healthcare cost in the nation.
The last question I'm going to ask has to do with healthcare, and it has to do with healthcare within our schools. I know that one of the changes to help balance the budget is to go to a regional nursing model, which would eliminate, I believe, 25 school nurses. And instead of having a nurse based at each school, there would be a nurse serving several schools. Having the school nurse there every day makes that nurse a familiar face that children grow to trust and will talk to. And having it be somebody who comes in only as needed, that there would be a real loss of that trust. Do you have anything to say about that?
I agree. I don't prefer to move to a model where there's less school nurses in buildings. And administration was very transparent when they were briefing their proposed budget and this particular change to staffing in schools to the board, that this is not their preferred proposal. The Anchorage School District, like all school districts in Alaska, are required to pass a balanced budget. And we have to align resources with the expenditures that we have. And this is it's a heartbreaking scenario that I think brings us back to where we started the conversation, that the path we're on for funding core services in our state is not sustainable. But it's not just education that's breaking right now. And until we get serious as a state about flooding your inbox, Representative Gray, with emails demanding that we implement a sustainable long-term fiscal plan, and that of your colleagues, and we have a chief executive who's willing to make those hard choices and collaborate in a meaningful way, I'm worried about our state's future. And I don't like that feeling. And as someone who's serving an elected office here locally in Anchorage, I'm going to fiercely advocate for elected officials at every level to do the right thing and continue pushing for a responsible path forward. But that's one of the many reductions in our budget that is deeply troubling and potentially reversible unless we see a significant change in the resources that are allocated to us.
School Board President Carl Jacobs, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Appreciate your time, sir.
Janice Strickland, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your early life.
My early life, well, you can hear from my voice that I hail from Texas. I have always believed that my life has been quite a wonderful adventure because, and I'm saying this honestly, I had such wonderful teachers. I'm still in contact with the few that are still alive. But that was my early life. Wonderful parents. Went to the University of Texas at Austin, taught in Texas for 19 years, and then we moved here in 1990.
Do you start at East Anchorage High School then?
Well, almost. I had 2 long-term subs, and then the next fall I was hired. I had a really great time. ASD has been wonderful to me.
So you started at Bettye Davis East Anchorage High School in
91 to 2.
Tell us what you teach.
Currently at student government. I've had student government since 92, 93. And then I have 3 classes of advanced placement English literature and composition. And I have a class of just delightful sophomores, English 2.
Over the years, you've taught Spanish and French, correct?
Oh, yes. When I came here, that's what they hired me for. The first year I had the Spanish 2. And then unfortunately, we just didn't have the enrollment this year to have an AP French class. So last year I had AP French, but we're on hold for that for a while. We'll see what happens.
So the reason why you're on the show today is because you are my constituent, and we had some contact about what everyone learned on Friday, which was that the Anchorage School District was making major cuts due to a $90 million shortfall. What's the experience like for teachers learning this? And how did you learn?
I can't say specifically, not because I'm trying to hide it, but I knew huge cuts were coming. I'm pretty good with money. And when you see 90 million, you know there are cuts. Please allow me to say, I think it's sad for everyone. No one likes bad things to happen to good people. And I think our superintendent has reinforced several times that this is not a value judgment. This is strictly money. But I must say that if I were one of those cut, it would be difficult not to take it personally. And so I try not to bring it up. We know the people that are going. And then because of the nature of the way the school district runs, we don't really know where people will go. If the people in another department choose to go back to the classroom, that can impact many of our teachers in all of our schools. It's very sad.
Right. Well, I think you wrote to me that that you've watched as the years have gone by, fewer folks doing more work.
Yes.
And because we focus on the teachers, but this is not just the teachers who are going to be cut, and it's going to be less people doing more work. So talk a little bit about that.
I don't know all of the inner workings, but we've been very fortunate in Anchorage. And I'm going to say this because I have lived here since 90. We've had good people. We've had good leadership. And I think that we felt that the prosperity of our state would continue. And so I think that those way above me have taken advantage of bringing good people here. Now, I don't know exactly how it's going to affect all of us yet. But for example, we're going to lose custodians in certain schools. We're losing clerical people, and we need people in those jobs. And it's hard to find competent people for those positions. And I think that what breaks my heart, although it doesn't have to do with more work, it's the decimation of the sports programs. But back to your earlier point, I think that more students in each classroom, certainly, because if you multiply 4 by 5, that means a teacher could end up with another 20 students, which is almost enough for another classroom FTE. But I do believe in my heart that teachers are good at changing. We're flexible, and our interest is always in our students. We want them to succeed.
Which is why you've stayed with it so long. I guess I know, but I just wonder from your perspective, you've already alluded to it in our conversation so far, that maybe our best days were behind us. And that's the fear.
That is the fear. That is the fear. I try to have faith that other things will happen. You worked so hard last year to increase the funding. What I think many people are worried about is just the basic solvency of the state. There are so many aspects to this. There's teacher retirement, there's PERS. Right now, we're having real trouble attracting teachers because there's no longer a defined benefits pension, which has always been a mainstay of the teaching profession. As one of my beloved principals once said, teachers always knew they weren't going to make really high salaries, but they knew they had a good retirement, and it was a great perk. And so as I watch this happen, I know that so many of our younger teachers would really like to have that particular pension or retirement. But I also know they're very cognizant that they're having to put more money away. But there's another problem. These are young people buying homes, having children. And we all know how difficult it is when we're young to save enough money. It's just a challenge. And these are good people. They love these students, but love doesn't pay bills. I've had people argue, but you teachers go into it for the students. Of course we do, but we have the same needs that other people have.
The Anchorage Educational Association, is that your union?
Yes.
And you guys just got a new contract that offers pay raises, which, I mean, on the one hand is great. Like, I'm thankful that teachers are getting raises, but I can't not look at it in the face of a $90 million shortfall and wonder where the raise is coming from.
I wonder that too. The other night, as I was watching the news, they juxtaposed the cuts and they didn't talk about it. They just showed it. And we saw the cuts and then we saw the raises. And I began to sense how I've always known how this could look to our community, because the question always is, where did the funds come from? I'm not saying that anyone did anything wrong, but it's difficult for our community. And I would like to know how we balance those two issues.
In Juneau, it does become a lot about 53 different school districts. They all have their own struggles, and the optics matter when we're talking about Anchorage.
But I believe that optics always matter. Optics always matter. And I understand completely. The other night, I just had that epiphany as the news had these, and I thought, how are we going to explain this? And please don't think I'm being negative, but I think that people who are losing jobs, particularly people maybe in, shall we say, salaries that are not quite so high, that's hard to explain. I don't try to. I keep thinking that there is a way to solve this problem, but I don't know what it would be. I don't know.
Not raising salaries, not being competitive is not going to retain our teachers.
I don't think the salary issue was as high for many of them as the huge increase in health care last year. It went up a great deal. It went up a
How
great
the
deal.
teachers had to pay for their health insurance.
Some of our teachers are paying over $1,000 a month.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. And it all depends on family,
Right.
the individuals you are insuring. But I will tell you, that is a huge amount of money. And I believe when I came to the Anchorage School District, Gary and I were both covered either for nothing or for $100 a month. And insurance is important. It is. It's necessary.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think many teachers really wanted the pay increase. I think most of the pay increase will go to insurance, even though the district increased the amount they're going to contribute. When you look at the percentage of what the district pays just for personnel, that's the big ticket.
You mentioned earlier that the loss of sports is a huge deal. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what the
Yes.
value of sports is in your 50 years in the classroom?
The value of sports that I've always seen is that many youngsters come to school to play sports. It was true in Texas and it's true in Alaska. Now, I used to say there were 3 draws for our students: sports, the fine arts, kids that love band, choir. Those are big. And another big one at one time, and I think it's coming back, it's what we used to call vocational ed, but we're moving towards CTE because youngsters are beginning to see that they need to get some preparation in high school for their futures. College isn't for everyone. It's just not. But the other day, we had just a brief discussion when the students found out about the sports. And of course, in my classes, I had outstanding tennis players, outstanding swimmers. Oh, and East has a wonderful cross-country skiing program. But I must say that I looked at that list of eliminations. That will change the way young people feel about coming to school. And of course, several of them mentioned that it was quite noticeable that basketball and football were not sacrificed at all. I am not judging. I'm simply saying when I look at that, students love their sports. And I think that last year we lost our choir director, a wonderful woman, a wonderful teacher. But we're taking away so much that attracts young people. And I know that we would all like to believe that they come to school to wax eloquently in AP Lit or to work till all hours of the night in AP Physics and AP Calculus, but they also love their social life, their sports life. And let's be honest, healthy bodies create healthy minds or help to create healthy minds. I'm devastated about the sports.
And I am too.
In fact, as I was thinking about what we would discuss, I wanted to really make that play for the sports because I was involved in those activities in high school. One learns so much about life in a competitive world, and we learn about being able to still be friends with people against whom we are battling, shall we say. Yes, I am very emotional about the loss of sports. It's just important to my youngsters.
Well, Janice Strickland, I cannot thank you enough for being on the show and for your over 50 years in the classroom and your over 30 years at East.
It's all been great.
I'm so grateful that you're still there and still working hard. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Jharrett Bryantt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. Great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss what's going on in ASD.
So you were on my podcast over 2 years ago in December 2023. So I'm just letting folks know if they want to learn more about you and your early life, that's the podcast they should listen to. This podcast is really focused on the $90 million shortfall in ASD and the difficult decisions that you as superintendent are being asked to make. It wasn't like the $90 million shortfall just suddenly appeared. So I guess, can you talk us through where you guys were prior to the veto override in August, and then what the process was like following the $700 increase to the BSA in terms of coming to terms with what the budget shortfall was going to be?
Yeah, sure. Andrew, that's a really good question because the community deserves to understand the timeline, because I think that the structure of school funding in terms of when the school board has to approve their budgets versus when the legislature finalizes their appropriations versus when the governor has the ability to veto and call special sessions, all that all play into the situation that we're in. So for the public's awareness, back about a year ago when the ASD school board passed the budget, at that point in time, we were aligning our budget to the previous BSA, the old BSA. At that time, the governor had already vetoed education funding. When we adopted that budget, we had zero indication that there would be one-time funding. And we had heard from the governor's office that even if more funding were approved, that it were likely that it were to be vetoed. The one thing the ASD had to lean on during that particular situation was, one, we did prepare a balanced budget at that time, but ASD also had a fund balance to lean on. And if you recall, because at this point, the governor had vetoed funding at least once that particular year, and because there was no indication that there would be any permanent increase to the BSA or even one-time funding for that matter, districts were told by the commissioner, by the governor, by the public, lean in on that fund balance to save as many things as you possibly can so we could avoid a catastrophe like the one that we're in now. So that's just the backtrack back to February of 2025. So we did that. And as you know, I and board members and our community advocated hard for structural reform because enough was enough. We couldn't handle balancing budgets based off of a number that may or may not be the actual number. You'll recall that there were some districts at that point that were actually balancing their budget based off of what they thought the legislature might approve or what could possibly be the BSA. In fact, there was another district that had done something like that, and they were off in their projections, and there was financial turmoil. And that's the last thing that I wanted for ASD, which is why we balanced our budget according to known BSA and the fund balance that we had in the bank, at which point that was equivalent to essentially a $700 BSA. So through that amount of money, we were able to, with confidence, tell the community that, hey, we can weather some of the projected PTR increases. It doesn't have to be a +4. It can be a plus, I think it might have been a +2 at the time when you consider the fund balance. That provided the runway to save programs such as Ignite. So then fast forward, a lot of wonderful advocacy happened. Our community was upset. Legislators like yourself was hearing from the community across the board about, hey, something has to be done. And I was just so proud and just so blessed to be able to witness that historic moment where the legislature was able to override the governor a second time. Because here's the other thing that people have to understand is that he not only had vetoed the funding once, but he also threatened to fund below the lawful BSA that the legislature had passed. So in my opinion, that would have led us into a constitutional crisis, because at that point, what can districts balance their budgets on? What's in the law, what the governor is willing to appropriate, some number in between. So the volatility was sky high. And then fast forward to that historic moment when the BSA was overridden for the second time. Finally, we could have a sigh of relief. But guess what? School is about to start about 2 weeks later. So we, like crazy, we scheduled an emergency board meeting. I still remember it, so that we could appropriate every additional new dollar from that BSA to restore things that we had already lost. Like I had mentioned, even with using our fund balance, we were still projecting a PTR increase. So we were able to use that small amount of new dollars from that happened shortly after the BSA increase That allowed us to address class size bubbles across the district. In addition, we invested a portion of the money towards high-dose tutoring, which we found is linked to better student outcomes in reading. And then the third piece, we set aside a couple $1 million for educator recruitment retention. But the important part, and that was a very long-winded way of sharing that, by then we had already assigned the fund balance to restore programs. And then the BSA happened many, many months after. So I think when you consider that context in mind, and by the way, at that very same time is when the feds had frozen the title dollars for districts across the nation. And that was also the same time that the commissioner was flirting with the idea of making changes to local contributions from municipalities to districts, which also would have cost the district potentially up to $10 million that we hadn't accounted for. So if you take all of that financial context and chaos, frankly, into consideration, I think it makes a lot of sense why the district chose to spend down its fund balance, largely being that by the time the BSA override happened for the second time, it was a couple weeks before school. Does that sound right, Andrew? You were there too.
Does. And it brought up a question for me. And, I think hindsight is 2020. But, if you budgeted for not having that $700 increase to the BSA and you made up for it by basically spending down your fund balance, I don't know if you were thinking about what the outlook was going to be for the next year, after like this major heavy lift of overriding a governor's veto, that maybe in his last year in office, we may not see additional funding. I don't know if there was any path towards keeping that fund balance once we knew that the BSA was secure and the override had happened. I guess this was because this $90 million shortfall is so devastating.
I think that we need to roll back the tapes because there were legislators that said, we're going to fight hard for this override because we want to be able to protect these programs. And some people probably wouldn't have voted for the override if they thought that we were going to save the money, because remember the very hostile climate that there was around fund balance for the past 2 years. Remember when the governor and the commissioner both requested that fund balances be produced and provided before the entire legislature without the context that it didn't account for cash flow issues and other things that made fund balances seem way more inflated than they actually were. So it makes a lot of sense when you think about that context that we were being told from commissioners, from legislators, from parents, we need to spend that fund balance because at the time, people thought last year was an emergency. So hindsight is 2020. But when you think about it with that lens as to what you and I both experienced firsthand, I think it makes sense why we did what we did. And I think that if you ask families today, did we do the right thing? If you're a parent that's participating in the immersion program, if you're a parent that has a kid in tennis, if you're a parent that has reasonable class sizes right now, you probably are thankful that the district did what it did. And from the superintendent perspective, the thing that I think about is that we have a lot to celebrate in ASD. One of the hardest things that I have to deal with is the fact when people say we invest so much in education and we don't see a lot of output. But over the past 4 years, I've seen wonderful things happen within the Anchorage School District. So for example, we have the highest graduation rates that we've had since before the pandemic. That's happened through strategic action that the school board and I took over the past 4 years. That didn't happen by accident. The second thing is that last year we saw a 5 percentage point gain in math proficiency for our 8th graders. And not just for the general population, we actually saw for our Indigenous populations and others, they saw even more growth. For advanced placement scores, we have 700 more kids in advanced placement than we had 4 years ago. And we've also seen advanced placement rates increase by 23% for underrepresented students. So we've actually made a lot of strides trying to do more with less. And I would have hoped that those data points, including an increase in literacy proficiency screener rates by 10%, would have actually made us realize, like, wow, we need to invest in schools. This is not the time to pull the rug out from under us. And that is why for the past 8 months, I've been conducting internally what we call the Protect the Progress Tour, because I've been trying to raise the alarm bells that if we don't protect that $700 investment, either through inflation proofing or through a reasonable one-time appropriation, we're about to lose these gains. But some people think that we should divest until we see more results. We saw the results and people are still advocating to take from schools. And I think that is wrong, morally and professionally.
Right. Well, it's just such terrible time to be in Juneau trying to fund not just education, to fund so many agencies, OCS, the Department of Law, public defenders, public guardians, like so many agencies are struggling and need more money. The bottom line is Alaska needs more revenue. We need folks to understand that in order to have the state that we want to have, we have to pay for it. And I don't know how to make that a political reality. I did want to ask a couple of difficult questions. One is, I definitely believe teachers should be paid well. I want good teachers to stay in Alaska and to stay in Anchorage. But the recent union contract that provides pay raises over the next few years, it just seems like the wrong time to be offering the pay raise with the $90 million shortfall. How do you respond to that?
Let me ask you a question, Andrew. What do you think would happen if I would have said there absolutely under no circumstances should be any raises for educators? What do you think would happen?
In the same way that I think we're asking the public to understand that this is not the superintendent's fault and this is not the school board's fault. It is not Anchorage School District's fault that they are massively underfunded. I think that there's an argument to be made to staff that we love you, we appreciate you, we want to pay you more, but if we do a salary increase, we'll have to let more people go. I don't know if that's a conversation.
But my question to you is, would you have been comfortable if you were in my shoes saying 0% for everybody because we see a $90 million deficit? And what do you think would have happened?
Honestly, I assume if somebody's very unhappy in their job and they're getting flat funded, that they would leave.
Yeah, they do. And what I've noticed is that we're in an educator retention crisis as a state because we continue to be the only state in the union that doesn't have the option for a defined benefit program. And why is that important? Because that means that all we have to offer is a salary. Our only chance of attracting somebody from Washington and Oregon and Texas is the fact that we can offer a higher salary. But even with a 4% or 5% raise, we're still not there. So really, our only value proposition as a state is to say, come to Alaska for mountains and outdoors and a great community. And for many people, that is compelling. But for many, that's not enough. And from what I've heard from our veteran teachers is it would be insulting to ask them to take on a PTR of +4. And in this hypothetical we're talking about with the 0% salary increase, so that would be a dramatic change to their everyday way of doing business and for no recognition of what that means on their day-to-day. And I only bring up the extreme of 0% because we're talking the difference between a 0% this year and a 3%, which is what we agreed to offer them this year. So we need to find a number between 0 and 3. So what number between 0 and 3 seems responsible when you're trying to maintain educators and also have a fighting chance at keeping the ones that you have, right? So I think as a state, the bigger conversation is, when are we going to feel comfortable saying that until that there's structural change, that we're comfortable having the least experienced teacher workforce in the entire country? Because that's where we're headed. If we are unwilling to invest in educator and educator leader wages, then we're really setting ourselves up to be a revolving door of new teachers. And when I talk to my community, that's not the vision that they have for education. So to go back to the question, which is a good one, was 5% too much? Was 4% too much? Some people would say, was 4% or 5% enough? And I feel for them because I'm with you, Andrew. Like, it's really difficult to make an investment that could potentially increase a deficit to be worse than it is. But at the end of the day, when you zoom out, when you think about the ways to increase reading proficiency, math proficiency, to ensure that students graduate from high school ready for colleges and career, you have to have strong teachers in the classroom. And I would love to hear from somebody that would argue that a 0% raise for a foreseeable amount of time would help retain anybody. I would love to hear from somebody to make the case to me how not increasing a wage at all in the light of extraordinary inflationary pressures, including extraordinary increases to healthcare, fuel, food. Our teachers are telling us that even with the 3%, they're going to take home net less pay, is what they told me. And for some people, based on whatever healthcare plan that they choose, they might still be in the red, even with the 4 or 5%. So again, I ask, was that unreasonable? Or was that a strategic choice to put your dollars in what makes an education institution strong, which are its educators and its principals?
What I can say is that my caucus in the Alaska State House is absolutely committed to funding as much as we can possibly find. I mean, we are absolutely committed to that, but I'm just curious if there's any other solution towards stopping some of the bleeding in the event that the state is not able to come through with as much money as you need.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. I'm really blessed that Mayor LaFrance showed an enormous amount of leadership when she approached me on her own accord and said, hey, I listened to this discussions between the school board and the assembly, and I realized that with the BSA increase, there's an opportunity for the municipality of Anchorage to increase its investment. And just for the listeners out there, the additional investment of that $700 BSA increased the headroom under the state local cap by about $11.8 million. So in other words, the city of Anchorage can invest an additional $11.8 million towards its public schools. So the mayor offered an opportunity. She said that she's going to pause all other revenue measures and put her full support behind a one-time levy for ASD that will fill that gap. And that's a really important opportunity because I've already pledged that every cent of that levy fund will be directed towards teacher positions. In fact, the ballot proposition itself will ask the voters the question of whether you support investing the $11.8 million towards teacher positions and student programming. So in other words, those dollars are going to be targeted directly towards what I feel the community wants the most, which are class sizes that can be as reasonably low as possible. So where does the legislature come in? I could use your help. I think that there's going to be a lot of headwinds to get this across the finish line. This is our first operational levy that we've embarked upon as a school district. I know that everybody's crunched. It is no trivial ask to the community. I completely understand that. For those listening, this levy would essentially be one time, and it would be about $27 per every $100,000 of property. So let's say that you have a home that's $400,000. You'd be chipping in over $100, which is not a trivial amount of money. But what I will say is that $11.8 million can generate at least 80 teacher positions. And even for a district as large as ASD, that makes a difference. 80 teachers is the equivalent of reducing class sizes by 2. So this dreary budget that is awful, that includes a lot of sacrifice, includes a +4 to the pupil to teacher ratio. If this levy passes, that effectively turns it from a +4 to a +2, which should make a huge difference. Will it solve our issues long term? No. But my belief is that our community deserves the opportunity to at least consider the question.
And let's say the legislature is able to come through with some amount of money. I know that there's going to be people who are really freaked out about the loss of their kids' sport. There's the regional nursing model, taking 25 school nurses out of schools. I think that's really, really troubling to people. No specifics, but I mean, depending on how much we can give you, is there a path towards minimizing some of the other cuts that are on the table?
Totally. I think that there is. So, of course, it is the school board that makes the final decision on appropriations. But based off of my conversations with the school board, they're really alarmed about some of these reductions. In addition to the PTR, we have a lot of people that want to make sure that we can afford to have a nurse in every school. For the Anchorage School District, that's been something that we've valued for a really long time. I do want to be very clear to the public that not every school district has that luxury. There are many school districts that abandoned nurses years, if not decades ago. And I think that it's a really powerful proof point that we've been able to maintain those positions for so long. And there's a real opportunity to restore things like that if we have the commitment from the legislature. In addition to that, of course, there's certainly a lot of conversation around sports and activities because this really makes sure that students are engaged and that they have fulfilling experiences outside of the classroom. That's another opportunity where I think there is synergy between what the public is saying that they need and what the school board is willing to appropriate.
So you came to ASD from HISD, Houston. school district. I assume that you have a network of other superintendents and colleagues across the country. Can you compare the struggles that you're going through with what folks in other parts of the country are going through? I mean, do you have the biggest load to bear?
I would say that there's similar struggles. I mean, across the board, states have a really unenviable task of allocating funding for resources in a resource scarce environment. And I think just like superintendents, the state legislatures across the country also have an axe that's hanging over us when it comes to the funding of all these other services, like things from the federal government that could be scaled back, that could result in more food insecurity, housing insecurity, all sorts of things. What does that mean for a state legislator? Is that now the pie is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And what I'm seeing is that costs are increasing. I just read an article today that even in Alaska, apparently there's a need to invest emergency dollars towards the prison system. Apparently there's growing costs there. And I can see it because when I look at the statewide budgets, departments by year, it looks like the Department of Corrections for Alaska has increased in funding by like 50% since 2012, whereas school districts have only increased by 8%. So clearly we're all feeling the crunch, but the difference is that certain departments are being inflation adjusted and schools are not. So I think nationwide, we're all trying to do more with less. But the difference with Alaska is that within our constitution, it's very clear that the founders of Alaska wanted a strong public school system, and it's the onus of the legislature to make sure that those school programs are maintained, that an adequate education can be maintained. And I know that there's difference of opinion as to what that means from a legal perspective, but that's why two districts are going to take the state to court to figure that out, because enough is enough. The time has run out. The rug is being pulled from under us. And if there's any hope at restoring a reputation as the place that once had one of the strongest school systems in the country, we're not going to get back there until we can figure out this fiscal plan.
When I had you on the podcast in December 2023, you described your predecessor, Dina Bishop, now the Commissioner of Education for the state of Alaska, as a class act. And you really just lavished praise upon her. Do you feel the same way now?
Let me put this in perspective because I am willing to answer it. I still stand by what I said during our first conversation because at the time, she was phenomenal with the onboarding process. And I'll just recap for the public why I said what I said. Because the minute that I was appointed superintendent, she was very gracious. She made sure that I was well connected to all the stakeholders. She moved out of her office. She made sure that I felt very welcomed. And this was all before she had any sort of interest in moving to the state. I thought we had a very positive relationship, and I have deep respect for the fact that she led ASD through the COVID pandemic and earthquake and a lot of things that are really difficult for a superintendent to get through. And she did so with a lot of grace, and I would say with a solid reputation. But I can't help but feeling betrayed in a number of ways by Dina over the years, and it's because of things that she did. I usually don't go on the record to talk about her very much because, as you can imagine, it's very awkward for me to talk about her because she is my staff member's former boss. I have the exact same team and the exact same school board that she had 4 years ago. And I want to be very respectful of those boundaries. But at this point in the game, I can't help but just underscore the sense of betrayal that I feel, not because she's changed her mind. Everybody has the ability to change their mind, but it's more the gaslighting. It's more the moments like the manufactured outrage over the Declaration of Independence, the manufactured outrage calling ASD a dumpster fire, all of this rhetoric on one end of the spectrum, and then turning around and just feeling that certain things are less sincere than they used to feel. I can't help but feel betrayal. But the bottom line is I know that she's a good person. I know that she has a strong moral compass. I don't know what changed, but I know that a really good person exists in there. I wish I would have seen that more.
The last question is there's a fear that Alaska's best days are behind it, that, we're basically in managed decline because there just seems to be this lack of will, not just among legislators, but among a lot of members of the public. There are some loud voices that scream that they're never going to have taxes in Alaska. And, if we don't have some sort of reliable, broad-based revenue stream, I don't think that we have a way forward. I don't know what it looks like from your eyes.
I have a lot of hope for Alaska. I choose to stay here because I believe that we can reclaim our top spot as one of the best places to be in the country. But I think what I find disheartening is this empty rhetoric that we can have wonderful services, we can get a large check from the government, and we don't have to make any sacrifices. And I will say that that empty rhetoric that I see from people in the community has really helped make me a better public servant, because I refuse to talk about education as some free service. There's nothing free about education. Education is about making a concerted investment that goes as deep as the state's constitution, that says what our values and North Star are as a state. And I think that Alaska has one of the most intentional founding documents of any state in the union. And I think as soon as we remember the principles and values that made us strong at statehood, we can find our way back. I know it. And when I talk to the legislators on various topics throughout the year, they give me hope too. I mean, we have some of the brightest, most passionate, most principled people serving in the legislature right now, present company included, who really believe in public schools, not for any sort of partisan reason other than there's no way to have a thriving workforce, thriving economy, and thriving state without strong schools. And here's the thing that drives me nuts is that people talk about private schools and charter schools all the time in Alaska, but I think we need to remind ourselves that Alaska actually has one of the highest public school enrollment rates of any state in the country. Very few people are choosing private schools in Alaska, and there's no indication that they want to grow their enrollments to serve any more students than they currently do. So the reality is, for everyday working people like you and me, we want to send our kids to public school, because if we can choose to live in a state that recognizes that schools and neighborhoods are what makes a state great, then I think that we can make sure that we have our priorities in order. But this empty rhetoric that you can have your roads plowed and you can have your trash picked up and you can have wonderful schools and you can have the check from the government for $3,000 and there's no sacrifice or investment that's aligned to our values and principles as a state, that's a missed opportunity. And I choose to be a public official that will not let people have that fantastical thinking. There is no such thing as a free lunch, and public school is one of the things that inspires me the most, because think about what other public service is there where for every 20 kids, the state government is ensuring that you have a high quality teacher who's there to work with your children, and that person's certified and trained and ready to make a difference. Let's say that you're a parent that has a special education student or a student with disabilities, that not only is there funding for that, but there are federal and state mandates that make sure that you get a baseline of education that can help move you to the next level. And you lose all of that when you start these empty conversations around outsourcing to private schools or outsourcing away from the public option, because all of those things are just a giant ruse to make people think they're getting something better. Well, what you're telling them is, we're done making that big investment into everyday school for working class people. Instead, we want to give everybody a coupon, because believe you me, the people that are pushing things like school vouchers and education savings account or whatever that is, they are not guaranteeing that you'll have a free education at a private school. They are offering you a coupon. And I guarantee you, in this fiscal climate, nobody wants a coupon. People want strong public schools. And that's what I'm going to fight for the rest of my career and for as long as I'm in Alaska.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Dr. Bryantt. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about?
I think I got myself in enough trouble, so.
Okay. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@ahlec.gov or call 907-465-4940.